Howdy everybody. I'm going to go ahead and continue my introduction to Nahua Thought lesson series. I'm going to do lesson 11 today. And lesson 11 is titled Nahuatl variants. What are they? And why are there so many? So if you are interested in learning Nahuatl, you've probably asked the question, how do I start? How do I start learning Nahuatl? And if you've asked this question to people who are familiar with the Nahuatl language, then you probably likely have heard something along the lines of, well, which variant do you want to learn? And I can imagine it's frustrating to hear that because many people treat Nahuatl as if it's a static one variety type of language, right? And that's not the case. That's not the case for any language. All languages, of course, have variations. So if you think about English, if you go to Australia or Great Britain, right, they're going to be pronouncing words differently than you, and not only that, they're probably going to have a lot of different words that you're not familiar with. Okay, and so that's the case for anybody who's ever gone to, South Africa, New Zealand. Like you see it very, very clearly, and that's kind of what happened with the Nahuatl language. Okay, so you can see on this map here, you've got there's different groupings of the Nahuatl language. Okay, and it's like if you go here, they're going to be pronouncing words differently, and they're going to be using different words than if you're over here, right? So it's the same concept as England, Australia, United States, New Zealand, right? South Africa, variants of English. The only thing that's different from that scenario is that if you're in Veracruz right here, okay, and this happened to me actually. I had two different teachers. I have two different teachers, and one teacher is from here. Um, Actually, it's probably closer here, and the Altepet is called Chicontepec, Chicontepec, Teposteco, okay. And so in that community, they say things like Genopa, Nokia, Noka, and that's fine. It's like that's what we call Huasteca Nahuatl. But then I have another teacher, and she is actually here. I mean, they're probably about 30 minutes away from each other, okay? 30 minutes from one teacher to the next. Very, very close. And when you go to her community, they don't say Kenopa, Nokia, and Noka. They say Henupa, Nohia, and Noha. Okay, so yeah, it's extremely different from Altepet to Altepet, even within the same zone. So they say, okay, this is Huasteca Nahuatl. All of this is Huasteca Nahuatl. But even within the zones, there's going to be some differences. And so that is surprising and sometimes shocking to people who are just trying to find resources to learn Nahuatl. But this is actually the very first hurdle that you're going to have to, uh, jump over in order to learn the language, okay, and really understand and really accept that, you're gonna have to find a variant that you want to learn, and you're gonna have to stick to that. Some people try to learn, different variants at the same time. Like they'll be like, oh, I'm gonna learn Jalisco Nahuatl and also Tlaxcala Nahuatl at the same time. And I don't know, maybe it works for some people, but I recommend, the way I see it from my experience, I recommend that you stick to one variant, you learn it extremely well, so that you can understand it, speak it, write it, and read it, right? And yeah, just really master that variant, and then move on to another variant if you want. Okay? And so, what are they? Why are there so many? Well, we talked about that already. Well, why there's so many is gonna be because, okay. So first of all, I made this video about classical Nahuatl. A lot of people think it's like the original Nahuatl. The closest thing we can get to describing classical Nahuatl is it was probably like a lingua franca. Like it was probably like the type of Nahuatl that was spoken by the merchants, right? And like people who traveled a lot, and that was like the way that they communicated with other merchants, right? So it was like a way for different Nahuatl communities to talk to each other. Maybe it's some linguists have referred to it as like a city variant of Nahuatl, right? And that was actually documented. It was written down, and dictionaries were made, and grammars were made, and so we know a lot about classical Nahuatl, and that's really really helpful because then what we can do is we can say, all right, how close is Nayarit Nahuatl to classical Nahuatl? We can compare them, right? And so the way you want to think about this is it wasn't like it wasn't like there was one Nahuatl, classical Nahuatl, in the 1500s, and then it devolved or changed into all these other variants because of the conquest. No, that's not right. We know that all of these variants actually existed already before the conquest. Okay, so they were already changed. Okay, there was just not somebody going to each community to document, the way that they spoke. In fact, the Spaniards um, were very. The Spaniards thought very highly of classical Nahuatl. They learned, a lot of them learned it, and at one point it was actually the official language of New Spain for a while, for several years, several decades even, and yeah. So I mean, there were Spaniards who were, writing books and teaching it and learning it, and we find that they would when they would make their grammars, they would make little notes saying that, oh, I went to this community over here, and they don't speak classical Nahuatl. They don't speak Nahuatl properly. It's very vulgar. It's a very lazy Nahuatl, they would say. But that's not the case. It's just the Nahuatl just was always different. And a lot of people did not realize that. I mean, even today, like, I'll encounter a native speaker who encounters another native speaker from like a totally different community, and they're just like, like, why are you talking like that? That's not how you say that, and they're just confused. And if you're hearing a different type of English for the first time, it can be a little jarring and confusing. And people are sometimes tempted to say, hey, that's not the right way to say it, right? But the reality is all of these variants are equally valid. There's not one that's better than the other. You know, and the other thing is some people have tried to say, okay, you know what? I want to learn the variant that is closest to classical Nahuatl. I've heard people say that, and they'll be like, okay, A lot of times people will be like, the closer it is to Mexico City, probably the closer it is to classical Nahuatl. Okay, and that is true in a lot of the parts of the language, for sure. That is true, but at the same time, it's important to understand that even the ones that are very close to Mexico City, like Tlaxcala, Milpa Alta, they have uh, differences. They do still have a lot of differences from classical Nahuatl. It's not going to be like exactly the same. Okay. But what I hope to show you is that I'm going to show you some words uh, that across the different variants, so we can kind of get an idea of like what are those differences between the variants, right? Like, are they big, and also how do they compare to classical Nahuatl? So we can kind of see, well, is there a pattern? Is there a particular variant that is closest to classical? And what's going to help us here is this book. This book is very difficult to find, by the way. I had a linguist friend who actually helped me. But, this book is exceedingly rare, unless you're in Mexico. Maybe if you're in Mexico, you could probably find it a little easier. But, it was made in 1986, and this is the author, Yolanda Lastra de Suarez. Okay, and the name of the book is Las Áreas Dialectales del Nahuatl Moderno. And this is an extraordinary book. It's the most important work on, modern Nahuatl variants, and it's so exhaustive that a lot of researchers haven't even scratched the surface of what is inside the book, right? And so we're so lucky to have it. And this researcher, Yolanda Lastra de Suarez, she said, you know what, we're gonna nail down not only the areas of where Nahuatl is spoken, but she had this team of researchers, and she said, I'm gonna send them all to different communities within each zone. And she had this list of words like clothing and work, husband, that, just like a random list of words that covered prepositions, verbs, nouns. And she sent her team of researchers to each of the communities, and they just asked the native speakers there, hey, how do you say this in Nahuatl? And they just recorded, what they said. And because they went to so many different places, I think it's got to be over like 50 communities, I think. And they went to Puebla, they went to El Salvador, they went to Nayarit, they went to Oaxaca, they went like everywhere. Not only the major places where there's the most speakers, you know what I mean? And so it was just an extraordinary work. And so I'm going to use that to just kind of explain to you what is meant by a variance. Okay, what is meant by that? And so we're going to start with en medio. So this is in the middle. They asked, people, and here are the abbreviations: Hidalgo, Morelos, Puebla, Guerrero, Veracruz, San Luis Potosí, Tuxpan, Michoacán. Okay, so you can see this is the F. So you can see all the different places: Tlaxcala, Puebla, right? And they're numbered because, like I said, within each state and zone, they had different communities that they went to as well. Okay, so like I told you before, if you're trying to learn Puebla, now what? Well, this is Puebla. There's 4 communities here that say the middle is Tlaco, and then there's another 4 communities within Puebla who don't use that. They say techin, techin instead. Okay, and so that's what I'm talking about. Like even even within the same state, it could be actually like pretty close to each other, and still they're like completely different. And so that's the frustrating thing about uh, the Nahuatl variants, because you'll be learning. Say, okay, Tlaco is in the middle. All right, good. Tlaco is in the middle, and then you talk to somebody from Hidalgo or San Luis Potosi, and they say it's Tlahuel, and you're like, wait, no, because in Veracruz, Tlahuel actually means like much. It means much. It's like an intensifier. And so if I say Tlahuel, Tlacuali, for example, Tlahuel, Tlacuali, that means there's a lot of food, you know. But if I say Tlahuel, Tlacuali in Hidalgo or San Luis Potosi, they're gonna think I'm saying in the middle of the food, right? And so there's a lot of just like I said, someone from the United States talking to somebody from England, they're gonna be using words differently, and they might have different meanings, right? And so sometimes it can be tricky. I had one of my teachers. She said that Huasteca speakers sometimes when they meet somebody from a place where they say hello, so they'll say hello like Tsino, which is kind of short for Panotzino. In Veracruz, they say Piali for hello, but there's a lot of confusion because when they say Tsino, the people from Veracruz, they think that the people are referring to their buttocks, because that's Tsino is butt in Veracruz, right? And so it can be like a huge culture shock, even to native speakers, right? And so the thing that we have to remember, though, as we go through all these examples, is like Nahuatl is still, even with all those differences, just like we speak English, and they also speak English in those other countries. It's the same. Like they're still speaking the same language, even though there's these differences. But these collective differences are what make those variants. Okay, and so some words are going to have a lot of differences from community to community. Others not so much. In this case, you have Tlahuel, Ne, Tlaco. This is Techin, Nepantla, and Ipan. Okay, now you may be wondering, well, out of all these, like which one is what was used in classical Nahuatl? And the answer to that is it's actually Nepantla. Nepantla was probably the more like precise word, like the most common word for Nepantla. You see it a lot in the sources, like the Florentine Codex. They use Nepantla a lot. Okay, but Tlaco usually means half, but in some cases in classical Nahuatl, they did use Tlaco for middle as well. So both of these would actually be classical Nahuatl terms. Ipan was also used here. Okay, so you might say, oh, well, that's definitely Mexico City, so maybe, they are using Nepantla because they're closer to where classical Nahuatl was spoken. So let's see if that holds up. Now you can see this one. This is ese, or that. There are a lot of there's a lot more variation here for this word. Okay, and we find that a lot, like for prepositions and like pronouns. There tends to be a lot of variation. So there are certain words, certain types of words, where it's just like so many different ones. Like, this is not a very long list. Like we can manage that, right? And so some words just happen to have a lot. Nane, yayampa, ne, anompa, no nepaka, nepaka, yaha, neka, inon, wanepa, nepa no neka, no ino, no neka. So this one is just like, there's a lot. And then fat. Okay, this is just like graso, saying someone's fat, right? We're talking about a person. But I mean, you can use it for like animals and inanimate objects as well. But we're talking about fat. So tilawak is the most common. And then you have tanyawa, tilaktik. This is chamawak. This is El Salvador. Chamawak. Tomaktik. Tomawak. So it says resto del área. So that means that tomawak is actually the most common. Tomawak. And if we look at the sources, the classical Nahuatl, this is classical Nahuatl here. Tomawa means to get fat, and tomawak means someone or something that is fat. Okay, so this matches the classical Nahuatl. And so it turns out that fat is not it's not highly varied, we would say, right? In these places, these specific communities, they use tilawak. Now you might be wondering, well, if they use tilawak and I came to their area and I said tomawak instead of tilawak, so I said, oh, tilawak tomawak, ne chichi, this dog is very fat. Will they understand me? And that's a really good question. And when it comes to variants, I've found that native speakers who are, aware of other native speakers, maybe they travel, they've had an opportunity to speak to a lot of different people from different places. Those speakers tend to adapt very quickly. And so if I go to Puebla and I meet someone like that, right? An educated native speaker who's aware of the differences, and I say tomawak instead of tilawak, they'll know what I'm talking about. They'll understand. They'll be able to shift, into that variant. Okay, and so that's the power of learning one variant. Because if you learn one variant, it's not actually difficult. It's not actually very difficult to then switch tomawak to tilawak, and we can treat the words actually like synonyms. They're just like synonyms of each other, and that's how they did it in classical Nahuatl, anyways, because this was also tilawa and tilawak were also present in classic. So classical Nahuatl already had two synonyms for this word. You know what I mean? And so it's not a huge jump. And fortunately, most words are like this. They don't change a lot. This is like the exception, right? Like most of the words are not going to have this many changes, and so it's going to make it easier to adapt. And so, if you're learning Nahuatl, it's very important that you keep that open mind. You understand that, we're not, this is this is not like a correct way of saying it. It's just one of many ways of saying this word. And we want to be open to like, okay, what are some other ways of saying it? And let's add that vocabulary. Let's make it a part of the synonym list that we have, right? And maybe you don't want to do all of them. Like maybe you're not going to deal with anybody in Tabasco or Michoacan, right? And maybe you just need these two, right? Like for light, Tlawili, very common. And this one is Tlanechtli. It says resto del área. So that these two are the most common, right? This one is maybe the third most common. This is Desushli. And there's usually not a U in Like classical Nahuatl doesn't have any U sounds. Um, and so that's another thing we have to wrap our hands around. Like some people, like in El Salvador and in these places, Guerrero, Mexico, uh, the state of Mexico, they actually do pronounce O's as U's. And so some people, like I told you, my teacher, instead of saying canopa, she says henupa, right? And so that's the other thing. Like you really can't like declare like Nahuatl rules, like hard Nahuatl rules. Even like I can't say like, oh, there's no U sound in Nahuatl, because these speakers are gonna be like, wait a minute, we have a U sound, and so again, it's like when you're learning about these variants, it's like try to avoid speaking matter of factly, because there's probably always going to be an exception to every single thing, and that's something really, really important to learn. Um, these are the classical Nahuatl versions, and so in classical Nahuatl light was this one. This is Shotla, to light up the carbons, Sanisa and Brasa as well. This is Neshli, and this is Tlash Oshli, right? So these are all Tlash Oshli, and so you see it change to U here from the original O, and that's the crazy thing too, is like that was even the case in the 1500s. The Spaniards noticed. They said, hey, you know what? Sometimes when we're talking to people, Nahuatl speakers, they'll be like, Calpuli, which means, like neighborhood or a little community. And then other people will say Calpoli. And so some of these sounds do change. This is close. So we have Peseli, Pestet. This is Testet, Yuyumik. This is Tlakemik, and then it continues here. Okay, so you've got Totontli, Tilma, Tatapatli, Papochot, Ropa. So some people just use the Spanish low word, right? Lana, Trapo, Cocomatli. And so, yeah, even clothes, is highly varied. And these are the classical Nahuatl. Even back then they were varied as well. You had Papachtik, Pepechtli, Totontli, and Tilmatli. Okay, so those were all the words for clothes. So it was already highly varied. I have another funny story. I've always learned Pestet. Pestet is close, because I'm learning the Veracruz, Huasteca Nahuatl, and in the community, in another community in Veracruz, Pestet actually means baby diapers, soiled baby diapers. And so you can imagine, the just all of the fun confusion that occurs. You're saying Pestet, and they're thinking you're talking about a baby diaper, right? And so those are just some other examples. And so when we talk about variants, this is what we're talking about, right? There's different ways of saying things. There's different ways of pronouncing things. You can see like Pestet is very closely related to Testet. So sometimes these the word, the sounds change. Just the sound is changing, right? But you can see that it's just the same word. And so that is an introduction to Nahuatl variants. I hope that you have a better idea now of what we're talking about when we say, you have to pick a variant when you're learning, because uh, it could be very, very confusing. You got the word down. It's okay. I got bestek, and then you meet a native speaker and they say Dilma, and you're like, what? It's supposed to be bestek, right? So again, we can treat Nahuatl. Some people, I've seen some people on the internet, they'll make arguments like Nahuatl variants are as different as like French and Spanish and Italian, and they'll make this claim that that all the variants represent actually different languages. Like sometimes they call them macro languages. But it is important to note that it's all the same language, and we know that because it's all kind of following the same processes. Like for here, for example, right? Like if I say tilawa, that means to get fat. Okay. But if I say tomawa, that means to get fat like a tomato, because this word is coming from tomat. And so this one is more precisely saying, you're becoming like a tomato, is basically. So the point here is like, it's following the rules of the Nahuatl language, right? Both of them are. If I say tilawak, that's something that has gotten fat. If I say tomawak, that's something that's gotten round like a tomato. And so in both cases, we're using that grammar. So like I was saying, the stronger your grammar is, the stronger you are at understanding the processes, like how this word like originated and how they're related to each other, the easier it's going to be for you when you talk to somebody from a different variant. Another example I don't think I have on here is like istak. Istak is the word for white in most places, but then in some places you also have chipawak for white, the color white. And then I've seen native speakers when they'll be like, oh, in my community we say istak for white, but like chipawak still means something, and they'll be like, well, chipawak means something that's clean in my community. And if you think about it, like in both cases, they actually both make sense, because chipawak comes from the word chipawa, which means to become clean, to become clean. And so the color white in that case is like something clean, which makes sense, right? And so if these native speakers understood the grammar, right, like they would be able to more easily be like, oh yeah, chipawak, it means clean, but I can see how it can also mean white, right? Because white is something clean. And then istak comes from istak, which is salt. So istak literally means it's salt-like, so it looks like salt, right? And so somebody who uses chipawak can then say, oh yeah, I can see how that makes sense. Like, yeah, istak. Again, it's the same language, it's the same grammar rules, right? And so as a result, it's just changes in pronunciations and word choice. That's literally it, And obviously, these differences will add up, and it'll make communicating a little difficult. If, like, let's say, like my teacher, let's say he lives here, right? And if he goes here to my other teachers' community, because they're both in Veracruz, even though that the sounds are very different and the words are kind of different, they're gonna be able to communicate no problem. You know, they could just adjust very quickly because the changes are very minute. They're not like drastic changes. You know, my teacher says he goes to Hidalgo all the time and he can speak to all the Nahuatl people there, Nahuatl speaking people there, even though he says, Nepantlan, they say ne or Tlahuel, he can still manage. He can understand them, and he says, yeah, it's fine. I can have a conversation. Uh, but if my teacher were to go to Oaxaca or Veracruz, that would be a different story, or Michoacan, because those places, the Nahuatl is going to have a lot of differences. You know what I mean? The further you go from your community, the more differences you're going to encounter. But at the same time, if you learn any of these variants, if you look at classical Nahuatl, you'll be able to read it. They've tested speakers actually in all these different places, and they test just to see, like, hey, can they read classical Nahuatl? And with a few modifications, they're able to read it. And so if you're interested in learning classical Nahuatl, you can still learn a modern variant and apply that to classical Nahuatl. Like, I'm learning Huasteca Nahuatl, and I can adjust and read the classical Nahuatl. So that's lesson 11 again, talking about Nahuatl variants. What are they? Why are there so many? And so I hope that you have a better understanding of Nahuatl variants. Please let me know if you have any questions or connections you'd like to share. As always, Tlaxcamati and Timoitasa.